Enquanto você ouve suas músicas e podcasts favoritos, deixa eu te perguntar, você já sabe da novidade do ano? Chegou a nova Fiat Titano. A nova picape da Fiat faz bonito nos terrenos mais desafiadores. Performance com motor turbo diesel 4x4 e câmera 360 graus off-road, que ajudam você a ultrapassar qualquer obstáculo. Sem falar que ela tem a maior caçamba da categoria. Tá esperando o que para conhecer? Nova Fiat Titano, chegou a sua vez de fazer história. Paz no trânsito começa por você.
Welcome to the Politics Guys, a place for bipartisan, rational, and civil debate on American politics and policy. I'm Trey Orndorff, a political scientist at Daytona State College and soon to be at Oklahoma Christian University. With me today is Ken Katkin, a professor at the Chase College of Law. Welcome to the show, Ken. It's great to be back with you.
Oh, yeah. Thanks for having me back, Trey.
Oh, it's always a lot of fun. This week, we've definitely had a fascinating week in news. And I think part of that is simply that the issues that interest me have been some of the biggest issues of the week. So you got to love it when you're doing the show that week. We have some big economic policy with the ongoing war of words with tariffs. All week, we've been bombarded with questions about policy in the digital age in light of the numerous bombshells regarding Facebook. And now, of course, Mark Zuckerberg being called to testify before Congress. And then finally, we have the story that I thought would be the biggest of the week, but which has flown a little bit under the radar, a potential pullout of troops from Syria. But why don't we start with the Trump-China tariff issue, if you will, Ken?
Sure.
And let's give us a little bit of context for this, and I've got some questions for you. So we have had a week of very mixed stock reactions to the growing war of words between China and the United States. As a matter of fact, stocks tumbled again on Friday, and it seems clear, I would be too, I am, that investors are worried about the potentiality of a trade war, especially after the Treasury Secretary and the Director of the National Economic Council stated on MSNBC and others that, quote, there is a potential for a trade war, end quote. Meanwhile, Powell, chairman of the Federal Reserve, has given no indication, especially in his Chicago speech this week, that the Fed is going to be deviating from its current path. So this has worried investors, it's worried analysts. So what are we talking about here? Well, so far, the actual tariffs imposed have been minimal. We've had aluminum and steel tariffs imposed by the U.S., and in response, China has responded with pork and wine tariffs as retaliation. Everything else so far this week has been saber-rattling, but it is, in fact, worrying everybody. Trump has doubled down both in his interviews on radio and on Twitter, arguing that we're not in a trade war because we've already lost the trade war. We have a huge trade deficit, he argues, and our loss of intellectual property, a topic we've actually covered on the show earlier this year. He's also arguing that the aluminum prices being 4% lower show his policies are working, so we need to double down. So there's just more than a little bit going on there, Ken. So what do you think about what's happening this week when it comes to international trade between the United States and China?
Well, it's hard to know what's actually happening. I'm not even sure that the aluminum and steel tariffs have already been imposed. I think he's already ordered that they be imposed, but there may still be a process, I think, that hasn't been completed yet to actually start imposing them. So the stock market fluctuations, I think I agree with what I took you to be saying, which is that every time they go up, it's because the stock market goes down because people think he's really going to do this. Then the stock market goes back up when people think he's not really going to do this, and that explains the fluctuations that we've seen this week.
Yes, for sure.
Yeah, but it's the politics of it are interesting. The economics of it, I guess we have to speculate. But the politics of it, most Republicans don't want these tariffs. They can mostly only be harmful to American business. I guess if there's an upside to them, that's could be possible. It could be good for American jobs at the expense of American business. So there's a constituency for that. I think the economic theory of whether that would actually happen or not is speculative, and I think trade wars overall for the total GNP they can't be good, but they could cause some redistribution from business to workers, which there could be some constituency for. It's just really hard to know what's going to happen, though.
No, I think, and it's right. I mean, there's kind of the two issues, what's kind of happening, the politics, the ideology of it being separate things. It is always fascinating when you have these situations because in economic policy, you generally have the good is distributed widely but minimally, right? So you have cheaper prices on things, and so that benefits you. And the kind of the negative consequences are generally more targeted on, as you're kind of pointing out, certain kind of workers, but generally not just workers in general, but workers in a particular class. So the pain is often um, distributed a little more, not a little bit, a lot more narrowly on a specific area. And so it's interesting. So one possibility here is to interpret this as maybe a move by Trump to attempt to reconnect with those specific groups of people by improving their plight, maybe necessarily at the expense potentially of a wider economic prosperity. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I think that's what it was. And actually, I don't know this, but I suspected at the time that he announced the aluminum and steel tariffs that it was partly an attempt to influence that special election that was going on in Southeast Pennsylvania, because Southeast Pennsylvania is an area with a lot of displaced steel workers. And so, there could have been a very localized benefit there. If you think of if we have fewer steel imports, then maybe more American steel is going to end up coming back a little bit. And there was a special election going on in the precise district where that would be a benefit. But it didn't actually provide him that benefit, because the Republicans did not hang on in that district, even with Trump's announcement of the aluminum and steel tariffs.
And I don't know if everybody noticed this, but if you looked carefully at China's proposed, not the ones that they are, putting in potentially into effect as opposed to retaliate against aluminum, but the broader proposed ones, you will notice that they are actually very clearly targeting kind of the head of the Republican Party. I mean, for instance, he's definitely taking aim at, say, Mitch McConnell. I mean, if you take a look at that list, it's really fascinating to see which items are getting
Kentucky
picked.
bourbon.
Yes,
Kentucky bourbon is number one. Yeah, and
which is I mean, smart move in a sense. I mean, I'm not condoning it, saying one ought to do it, but it's fascinating.
yeah. Well, the Republican congressional leadership doesn't want these tariffs at all, anyhow. But it'll just make it that much more painful for them. The agricultural tariffs, which are also hitting farmers, which are a big Chinese agricultural tariffs aimed at farmers in the U.S. Farm Belt. That, I think, is also similar to what you just said. That's another direct shot at Trump voters, that the Chinese government's trying to make them feel the most pain for this. Although that's a dangerous game for China, because they have, food is expensive there, and it's hard for them to feed their whole population. And they're going to be inflicting a lot of pain on their own population if they really impose the tariffs against soybeans and things like that they're talking about, which I think the fact that they would even be talking about something that would impose so much pain on themselves, I think is really more evidence for the theory that you just said, that they're really specifically, their whole goal here is to try to inflict tariffs on that will hurt regions of our country that were strongly supportive of Trump.
And the other thing that's interesting, so I mean, that's kind of the pragmatic politics side of it. The other thing that's really interesting to me is, oh, wow, I mean, over a year ago, we were talking about some of the interesting overlays between Trump, because he, as you've noted a couple of times now, Trump is not aligned with the majority of Republicans on the issue of tariffs. As a matter of fact, I mean, he is far more, he's going to be far more aligned with a guy like Bernie Sanders, which has brought up some really interesting pieces this week, because you've got Bernie Sanders and others actually kind of supporting these moves out in the open, saying, well, I don't like the way he's going about it, the bombastic nature of it, of course. But, in general, I agree in the abstract with what's happening here. He was followed by, close to you, Sherrod Brown, Bob Casey, and others. And so it's interesting, because we've been pointing out on the show how this is a point where the left and Trump actually have a lot of common ground. I mean, is another possibility here for Trump with tariffs? I mean, it's difficult to attack him on this from the left. What do you think about that?
Yeah, from the left. I think the center left, the sort of the Hillary Clinton wing of the Democratic Party, would be more aligned with the Republican congressional leadership on this issue. But it's absolutely right that the Sanders wing of the Democratic Party, the Sherrod Brown wing, they'll be aligned with Trump on this issue, and that's the way that Trump won states like Michigan and Ohio and Wisconsin, right? Those voters, these are traditional Democratic voters for whom trade was a very very important issue, and that constituency is probably going to be the strongest supporters of what Trump is doing right now.
I mean, do you think, man, one of the things that, and I'll be honest, this is kind of, I'll be transparent, obviously, in my own ideology here, that worries me specifically is that a combination of these kinds of voters could lead to what I see as very disastrous tariff policies being possible. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't use the word disastrous, but I agree with you. It's negative. I think these tariff policies are harmful to the country. I think there may be some. It's hard to know exactly how big a deal they are, and there's the debate. People talk about what caused the Great Depression, and for a long time, I think a dominant theory was that the Smoot-Hawley tariff caused it,
Yes, yes.
and so that's disastrous. But I think now, I think more contemporary economic historians would say, well, that was a small factor in it, and it was really just the stock market crash that caused it, and like we saw in 2008. So I think I do agree with you that these tariffs have a negative effect on the economy. I don't know the magnitude of it, though. I think it's hard to say how negative of an effect on the economy.
Now, and this is a really difficult question. I recognize we're going to be speculating here for a second, but I mean, one of the things that's interesting to me is I think that for a long time there has been a left-right, at least among your Republicans and Democrats, right? I mean, you have obviously further right and further left who can have some disagreements, but among those two, that free trade, free economic exchange was a net benefit for the country. And I mean, you saw that in the fact that it's Bill Clinton who's signing NAFTA. And
Oh,
it
yeah.
seems today, though, that we're having a shift. And when you take a look at the polling data by age, it looks to me like that part of this rift, I mean, I know Bernie Sanders obviously doesn't fit this stereotype, but a lot of his supporters do, that the younger you are, the far less likely you are going to be an advocate for free and open trade and borders, and that seems to be a potential shift as we move forward. And it also seems to me to be, I mean, again, a bit of a speculation. It seems that when you have that view, that it goes along with an enhanced sense of isolationism and nationalism.
Yeah, I agree with that. I'm not totally sure about the age thing, but I agree about a lot else of what you said. The I think displaced formerly people who were in the manufacturing sector and who actually were displaced from their jobs tend to be older, and I think that is a constituency that really does not like free trade. So I'm not sure it's just younger people that don't like free trade. I think it was older voters in Ohio, Wisconsin, Michigan that may have tipped that election. People who used to work in manufacturing.
No disagreement.
But yeah, but yeah, younger people as well. They don't have the opportunities today. Especially the non-college segment of the population. If you've got people coming out of high school today, maybe not going to college, or maybe going to some college but not graduating, and that's got to be half or more of young people. There's the opportunities that are available to them today are nowhere near as good as the opportunities that would have been available to people in that demographic a generation or two ago. And I think they do tend to blame a lot of that on free trade. That the kinds of jobs that their parents or grandparents had are in China now. They're not in America, and so that's a political problem.
No, I think you're absolutely right, and I wasn't, and you're right that in the current election. But what I think might be interesting is to see if does that mean that these kinds of elections become more likely if as time moves forward as a result of demographic feelings shifting about trade policy. But and you're right when you're talking about students. I mean, from personal experience, I mean, I know you're getting them a little bit later in the process than I do.
Yeah.
But it's amazing how often you'll have students who are working and they're making just a little bit of money, comparatively speaking, and they sacrifice their long-term good. Right, it's the marshmallow test. Right, they sacrifice their long-term good by not finishing the degree or screwing up the degree and going longer because they get this immediate it good of, well, I'm working and I'm getting this. And I think, well, you're not going to want to live on that forever. But anyway, that's a sidebar.
Yeah, but see, two generations ago, they easily could have lived on that forever if they had a high school degree and they went to work in an automobile plant or something.
Exactly.
And yeah, they'd be good for life. Now, here's one thing we can talk about where we might have some left-right differences. I think that has more to do with the decline of unionism than with anything about international trade. So I think if we had strong unions today, like we had 2 generations ago, you could still have better wages and better benefits and better job security, even in today's economic environment for basically for the kind of workers who are not professional class workers. And I think the reason that those jobs have gotten so much worse is because unions have gotten so much weaker. But I know that a lot of people in that demographic would not look at that as the cause, but would look more at free trade as the cause.
Now, that's a fascinating claim. I mean, because one of the things that we have moved toward in the United States has been a more service intellectual production economy. So, I mean, do you really think that unions could have stayed that tide?
No, yeah, because I think the service economy is a broad phrase, but it includes service intellectual, as you said, but it also includes service relatively unskilled. So if you look at like people who work in retail or in fast food or in all kinds of jobs like that, they have a union, but their union doesn't have the same kind of clout that the United Auto Workers would have had a generation or two ago, even though there's similarly large numbers of people working in these occupations. And so we sort of had a tradition that the strong unions were tied to the manufacturing trades. Perhaps the weaker unions were tied to the unskilled service trades, and those were seen as lower wage jobs. But I think if workers in those kinds of jobs would engage in the kind of strong collective action that Teamsters and people like that were willing to engage in a couple of generations ago, I think they could be having higher wages and higher benefits. So instead, to me, the question isn't why did we lose steel to China? To me, the question is why does a worker in a retail store not get $30 an hour? And so because I think that's the equivalent of what the auto worker would have got a couple generations ago. And I think the auto workers got it because they fought for it, not so much because of any particular international trade context.
Fascinating. I would argue that the reason you don't see that kind of shift, and maybe we're not having quite the ideological battle that listeners would hope for, is because simply that the market is not going to bear the $30 an hour individual at the retail store, right? So back in the day when I was working at TJ Maxx, if I was making $30, then nobody would have been shopping there. Not that I wouldn't have liked $30 an hour, but
Yeah, see, I just don't agree with that. I think that the same arguments could have been made in the auto industry in the 50s and 60s, right? That that the auto companies would have said, well, if we have to pay all our workers really high wages like that to make automobiles, then nobody's going to buy an automobile. But in fact, that wasn't true, right? That the unions forced them to pay that much. The prices of the cars went up a bit, and people did pay that much, and the industries were successful through the period of time when the unions were strong. So we don't really know. I mean, there are some differences. Like if you look at in the big box stores, you have Costco where they have strong unions, and then you have Walmart where they don't. And the job is basically the same job, and the people at Costco get paid a lot more, and both companies do fine. So I don't know that it's obvious that I think I would look at that as a standard kind of conservative argument that the businesses can't afford to pay more because they'd have to charge more and then they wouldn't be able to sell their products. But I'd say from my perspective on the left, I just don't buy it. I think that if they charged a little more so they could pay a little more, then people would still buy the products.
But I mean, if that was true, I mean, so if the Costco Walmart argument, if that is the central nature of it, then why wouldn't you have firms attempting to bid up labor to get the best people?
I think they're more, again, we're talking, I think that is what happens in the professional sector that you were talking about. But I think if you're talking about the relatively unskilled sector, they don't need the best people. They'd rather get the cheapest people. And that's why the only way that those kind of workers, I think, can get their wages up is through collective action.
So but they would then have to have the recognition that they need collective action, which kind of seems to be impossible in this. Fascinating. I think we might have a small difference there.
Yeah.
No, now I think we've probably veered enough away
far.
from
Yeah,
tariffs.
yeah.
But no, that's all good. Maybe we'll have to return to that. I know that oftentimes listeners are deeply interested in nothing gets people more commenting on social media than when we have comments about economics, and I think that's because we oftentimes vote retrospectively with our wallet. But
Right.
but let's move on to something a little more abstract, but also concrete, and that's what's been happening with Facebook. Facebook, and I'm sure that they are not happy about this, have been dominating the news for the last week, and for, in their opinion, again, all the wrong reasons. And it has opened up a lot of important questions concerning privacy in the digital era. But let's just start by looking at what's going on with Facebook and Mark Zuckerberg specifically. The first story that broke was Cambridge Analytica. It was a political consultancy group that was hired by the Trump campaign. And the group gathered detailed and improperly gathered details on Facebook information for 87 million people, of whom 71 million were Americans. And in effect, just to break this down simply, what made this possible was that it used an app, that's an application that interfaces with Facebook, to gather data from people who took a quiz. Now, that doesn't seem like a big deal, but basically they were using some loopholes in the Facebook rules to allow them to not just gather the data on the people who were using in the app, but everybody who was connected to the person who was using the app. And so even people who had not consented, even perfunctorily, to this, had their data skimmed for the purposes of the Cambridge Analytica app. Well, then we find out that Facebook search tools have been using for data. So people were skimming data off of the search tool after having purchased some basic information from the dark web. Then we also find out that Facebook was discovered, at least on Android phones, those of you who on iOS like myself were safe, to be recording your call and texting data. And it confirmed that it scans all of your messaging app conversations. And those are just some of the biggest news items. There are more. We obviously can't cover them all here, but just to give you kind of a few of them. This has led to, and I'm sure we're going to talk about it on the show next week as well, Zuckerberg being called to Capitol Hill for a series of hearings this week. As a matter of fact, Ed Markey, a Democrat from Massachusetts, has argued that Facebook has had a, quote, avalanche of privacy violations, end quote, that strikes Americans' right to privacy. Facebook is going to go so far this week as to take out a full newspaper ad, which is very ironic, apologizing for all of its digital problems. Interestingly, it wasn't that long ago government was upset with another tech giant over privacy. It was Apple. Only that time, it was for being a little too private and not building in backdoors for the government. So as a result, this week, kind of the penultimate of the conversation has been between Tim Cook of Apple and Mark Zuckerberg of Facebook, having a substantial war of words leading up to the congressional hearings over the role of tech companies in privacy. Cook has argued that there are some things that are, quote, bad for civilization, end quote, and you just shouldn't create it. Instead, Cook argues that you should never make the consumer, i.e. their data, the product. Zuckerberg has argued that Cook's comments are glib and that to make services freely available, they need to make the consumer the product. Otherwise, only elites can use technology. And that seems to potentially be the argument he'll be taking in to Congress later. So Ken, if you were Congress, what would you be asking Zuckerberg? And especially this week in light of the EU passing this massive privacy bill, digital privacy bill. Is it time for the U.S. to think more carefully about this issue? What would you be asking Zuckerberg? What do you think about this?
Yeah, I mean, it is a very hard question to set the right policy on because it seems to me people consumers rightly get very upset when personal data is being collected on them in some secretive way and is being sold and shared outside their knowledge. On the other hand, I think the countervailing point is that if people know this is going on and they're asked, how much do we have to pay you to have all this data about you? People accept very low prices for that, right? So if you think about like the grocery store card or something like that, the grocery store says to you, you can have a frequent shopper card, and if you tell us by using that card every product you're ever buying ever, so that we can have a complete picture of all your consumer habits. We'll give you like $1 or $2 off, when you come to the cash register. People are willing to take that. Almost everybody's willing to take that deal. So it's a complicated question that people would sell this information for very low prices, but they get very upset when this kind of information is used without their knowledge or consent.
No, and you're right. I mean, at a fundamental level, we do sell those. I think the other part that makes the Facebook story so particularly personal is, and you make a really great example of other areas where we sell our data either explicitly or implicitly, like with you get your Kroger card or you get your
Yep.
Winn-Dixie card and you head to the grocery store. But I think for a lot of people, when you start saying, well, how often and when do I buy milk and eggs, probably falls into a different bucket for most people than, all of the conversations I'm having over text message with my wife, the person
Yeah.
who's not my wife,
Right,
all of
right.
these potential things, combined with, say, all of my children's photos. And so what do you think about, I think
Yeah.
the average American, they're going to put those in separate buckets. They're going to go, yeah, my milk is one thing, but my baby pictures and my conversations with my wife, that's another thing.
Yeah, I agree with you there. Although I wouldn't, the milk is one thing. Remember, this is data that could be sold to people like health insurers who are going to, see that you eat a little too much ice cream and they better charge you higher premiums for
Hmm.
insurance. So I think that stuff does actually reveal a lot of things about you that could have a real impact in your life. So I wouldn't minimize that, but I certainly do agree with you that people will be a lot more concerned about the things that they consider more personal and private. Yeah, there's something so creepy about what Facebook did that it seems that it ought to be illegal. But on the other hand, I think it's very hard to figure out how to draw those laws that in ways that don't interfere with kind of everyday transactions where people actually would rather give up some privacy in order to get some financial benefit of some sort or another. I mean, I don't know how many people would pay $10 a month to use Facebook, say, if there was an absolute rule against reselling user data, and so Facebook went from being a advertiser sponsored service to being a subscription service that the users had to pay for. I think a lot less people would be interested in it on that basis.
Oh, I think you're right. And as a matter of fact, I think you're also very right about the amount of data that gets collected with you at the grocery store. So, for instance, I don't know if you remember the story from a couple of years ago when Target was able to predict when you were going to be pregnant. Did you read about that one?
No, I didn't.
This is actually, listeners, this is fascinating. You can go look this up. I use it in class. Target began using it collects a bunch of data on you because if you use their credit card, right? That's kind of like having a store card, and they can
Yeah.
predict all kinds of things about you. Well, what they wanted to be able to do was effectively when to send you the right kinds of coupons to get you to come back into the store, right? Which is a classic example. As a matter of fact, my wife used to work for the Kroger Corporation, so I know about some of this from the background side too. But in this case, it was Target. And so what happened was that the predictors of when a woman was pregnant actually began to outpace when the women themselves would know they were pregnant. And so what began to happen was they were getting basically, congratulations, you're pregnant. Here are some coupons so that you'll come to Target and start preparing before, yeah, before they knew that they were pregnant. So they were getting ready like, well, that's stupid. Why are you? Oh, and as you can imagine, that creeped a lot of people out.
Yeah.
And and so today, as a matter of fact, Target now builds into its system, there is a delay. Like, so they still know that you're pregnant before you do, based on your purchase habits, but they don't send you those as quickly.
So,
um,
so they can tell by like changes in what kind of food people are purchasing, or changes in whether they're buying condoms or not, or how do they know that?
I don't have that answer. I mean,
Yeah.
that's part of the secret. I mean, the
Yeah, yeah,
ability
yeah.
to have that big data, but the fact that they were able to do it. So, I mean, it's obviously some combination of changing of purchases, increasing of purchases, and purchasing habits for the user
Right.
indicates, hey, wait a second, we're increasing your likelihood of being pregnant by X amount.
Hmm.
So I agree with you on the private, and so I guess what's interesting to the Facebook question is that I think for a long time this has been an issue that most of us have overlooked because we haven't really thought carefully about the implications of what massive statistical models can predict when we have giant n's
Right,
and
right.
the amount of information that we put into that. So I don't think we should be lambasting the statistical models. They've been around forever. And you're right to point out that it's not just Facebook. But I think that the upside to things like Facebook or Zuckerberg is I don't think any of us, few of us, I have, but I'm the weird guy who is like shouting into the wilderness. Um, I don't think most people have thought carefully about what this might mean. I don't think they've made active choices. They've just made these passive choices where they've clicked accept and they haven't really thought about, well, what is the end result of this?
Right, I agree with you there, and I think the sort of cultural shift is people expect when you walk around in a city today, you actually expect that you're on a surveillance camera everywhere you're going. I think people expect that the kind of privacy people had a generation ago or 2 generations ago, again, it's just gone. Everyone's under surveillance all the time, and I think because people expect that, they don't worry about it as much. But that the kinds of things that Cambridge Analytica was doing with this data, it's causing harms to people that people can't even contemplate, that they might think, well, what do I care if somebody knows what groceries I buy, or even what political posts I post on Facebook? If I post political posts on Facebooks for my friends to read, then I'm not trying to keep my politics secret, so what do I care? But they don't really realize that that's opening up more data about them to being used in big data models that can manipulate them in a variety of ways, so that there's that component of privacy as well.
Yeah, and so, and then this is again, I know we were kind of taking the tariff a little bit further, but maybe we could do this with Zuckerberg. But I really have been thinking about if I'm Congress, what are the pragmatic questions that I'd want to ask Zuckerberg about privacy, Facebook, to help us, if I was really trying to honestly think about this issue, because I think it's a complicated one, what would I want to know from him? Obviously, this is a chance to grandstand, but if I was just trying to be, thoughtful in policy, what would be my honest questions? Do you have any things that you'd be interested in asking, Ken?
Yeah, maybe there was a op-ed in the New York Times yesterday by Jonathan Zittrain. He's a internet professor at Harvard, and he thought that the right kind of approach for Congress to take is to, in the same kind of way that doctors and lawyers, as part of their professional responsibility, have fiduciary responsibilities to their clients, which include, its responsibilities to give them the right kinds of advice and responsibilities to safeguard the private information that they hear from their clients. He thought that kind of thing could provide a good model for how to think about what kinds of duties a company like Facebook would owe to its customers, to put them in that kind of ethical trust relationship or fiduciary relationship. That sounds to me like a sensible proposal, although I still don't know how you iron out the details of what that would mean in this context.
Yeah, especially since the oversight of that would involve making trade secrets known that I don't think that these companies, under the current model at least, would be willing to be made known. And just like when you're asking about Target, that's one of the interesting things about this. The ability, the way that you are parsing that data is your moneymaker. If other people have that, then they can make comparable products.
Yeah, well, I think the Zittrain proposal wouldn't necessarily require that they disclose those formulas to regulators, but I think what it would require is that they not they not try to give advice to their users that's not in the interests of the users. So the analogy, the analogy that he makes is, he says, a doctor, if a doctor diagnoses you and thinks one medicine would be in your best interest, the doctor doesn't say to you, well, do you consent to me just giving you poison, or would you prefer the medicine that will actually help you? And he says that the way the companies like Facebook have been using these the data they have, it's not just how they're collecting it or how they're analyzing it, but it's how they're actually using it. They're using it in ways that are harmful to the Facebook users, because they're selling it to companies like Cambridge Analytica that they know will use it to put fake news out there and things like that, and that they know that's not in the interests of their users. So that would be the point of regulation, I guess, under this Zittrain proposal, would be to say don't abuse the data in ways that is likely to be harmful to the customers, to the end users. So I don't, it doesn't, the trade secret aspect of it doesn't bother me, but the details of how you really make a rule like that you could enforce, I think there's some work to be done filling in those blanks.
Yeah, and yeah, that's a monumental task. And I know that the EU has one, but I know that also many companies they're happy about it in one sense, but they're frustrated with it in another, since it's very difficult to tell when or when not you are actually abiding by the new rules, although we don't want to get too deeply into that. But to maybe kind of make a point back to the tariffs and to connect it here. I mean, again, we were arguing a minute ago between the Walmart and Costco, what's going to win out, lower cost. I mean, is the Facebook model, the zero cost, the low cost? I mean, is that not necessarily the inevitable move for most people? What do you think?
Yeah, absolutely. Because in the internet, the value you get from using a social networking service is mainly based on how many of your friends are using the same service, and
Hmm.
so the zero cost has to win out, right? Because that's the one that most people are going to use. So therefore, that's going to be the one that has the highest value to anyone using it.
Yeah, and that's a fascinating one because one of the early questions or models of the internet, a book that I'd recommended a while ago, The Innovators, talks about some of the early creators of the internet. One of their sad retrospectives was the wish that they could have had multiple requirements for a link, such that you could have basically monetized in the internet people linking to your services. In other words, a way of having money without having to have had ads in a way that would have been more largely invisible to the average user. But that model did not win out, and so we live in a world where we're going to continue to have the question of Tim Cook on one side saying, "Look, you should be paying a little bit more, but you get encryption and you get privacy," and Mark Zuckerberg saying, "That's elitist. I need your data to make this work."
Yeah, although if you made the Zuckerberg model illegal, then the Cook model could work. But if they're competing against each other in free competition, I think the users are overwhelmingly going to go for the free model. But the Congress could have a role in just saying, well, that's an illegal model, and I think people would pay $5 a month for a more private version of Facebook where their information's not being collected if the free option wasn't available because it's illegal.
Yes, I mean, I think you're right about that, but I think it would be a difficult pass by Congress, given that model of free is the ubiquitous version of what people want to use. I think that's the fundamental problem here is that people they think that they want something for free, but then you have Google or you have Facebook and they suck their data up and you're upset about it. But how many people have actually deleted their Facebook accounts
Yeah,
or are
that's the
going
same.
to?
I agree completely. That's the same thing I was trying to use through my grocery card example. That I mean, most people actually like the discount, even though the discount's not that much. So they'll get a Kroger card, and they're giving away enormous amounts of private information for a very low price. But the reason they do that is because they'd rather save the few dollars than keep the information private.
Hmm. And so we'll probably constantly have these circles, but I mean the last thing maybe we can leave off on is in a world where we're now talking about moving beyond just silicon for the future of processing, the ability to gather data will only increase, and I think that these questions will become increasingly pertinent and difficult. They won't get any easier to solve as time moves on. I think they will only become more difficult.
Yeah,
But
we agree there.
well, our last go, what I thought was going to be our big story this week. I was prepping for the show and I was driving to school to teach my 8 a.m. class when I heard on NPR Trump going off strip and announcing at a rally that the U.S. would be pulling out of Syria with haste. And he has said, "quote I want to get out. I want to bring our troops back home." End quote. And I thought, oh my goodness, this is going to be the deal. Now the story was hot then. It kind of got buried in the face of everything that we've been talking about on tariffs. But it has actually reemerged again on Thursday and specifically on Friday. And I think it is one of importance, even though it hasn't quite gotten the number of words that you might normally imagine. The Hill and the Washington Post are reporting that Donald Trump still wants to dramatically scale back the U.S. goals in Syria in advance of a full military withdrawal. In short, he doesn't want to deal with state building. It is a position in opposition to his military advisors, according to whom The Hill and The Post are reporting he is butting heads. It is actually similar to the debate he had over Afghanistan. In that instance, Trump agreed to back down. This time, however, there are reports that he is giving the U.S. military there a 6-month deadline to, quote, defeat the Islamic State, end quote. So a very nebulous goal. The Pentagon has been denying the reports of the 6-month timeline. So we'll see where that moves forward, but I'm not surprised that they're denying it. In some ways, Ken, this is a more bombastic version of what occurred with Obama. Obama came into office and he wanted to scale back operations in Iraq and Afghanistan, and he was never really able to get all those troops out for a number of reasons. And then the now infamous circumstances surrounding Hillary Clinton would get Obama involved in Syria in the first place, and as a matter of fact, expanding and instead of retracting from countries around the world. So what do you think of this particular set of moves by Trump, or at least overtures towards moves by Trump? And what do you think ought to be the role of the U.S. in this kind of long-term state-building exercise? I mean, we've now had both George W. Bush engage in this, Barack Obama engage in it, even though he did not want to, and now we have Trump. What is he going to do, and what do you think he ought to do?
Well, I think that Syria is a little different than Iraq, maybe more analogous to Afghanistan. But in Iraq, we didn't have to go in there in the first place, so there was no immediate pressing emergency that caused us to go to Iraq, and so the concept of going there was almost, I think, entirely based on an ideological notion that the U.S. should go and start nation building in the Middle East to provide an example to the rest of the Middle East about what kind of how they could have a more democratic style of government. I think in Afghanistan, obviously, we did go there because the September 11th. Because the Taliban had taken over and Bin Laden had run there, and so just trying to get him, I think there was really no alternative for the U.S. but to go to Afghanistan when that's where Bin Laden was. Syria, it's a mixture, right? There's very, very serious human rights abuses and chaos going on there right now, and ISIS had taken over some of the geographic territory of that country. So I think a military response of some sort was certainly warranted. I didn't oppose it. I don't oppose it. In terms of what would happen if we pull out now, that's the kind of problem that Obama was facing that you were talking about, right? That Obama would not have ever sent troops to Iraq, but if you inherit a situation like that, the pullout itself could be really chaotic and destabilizing and cause a lot of human rights abuses and a lot of maybe even a lot of death. So I would say at this point the U.S. is in, and it's not. I'm on the side of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and the Secretary of Defense here. I don't think we can just pull out just like that on an arbitrary deadline.
It's funny because as listeners will know, I am a pretty harsh to very harsh critic of President Trump.
Yeah.
But this is one where I actually have some sympathy with his long-term goals here because we now have long-term state-building projects, and I agree with you actually, Ken, on kind of your analysis of how we've wound up in each of the three countries. But I think where we have struggled with a military policy is in the end of these conflicts, what has become known as the state-building portion. We haven't been particularly good at building states. We haven't been particularly good at changing the dynamic of power. I know one of the arguments here has been we need to be careful because Russia is basically going to, swoop in and have influence over the area if we don't maintain influence. And in all honesty, that sounds very much like the flawed Cold War policies of the past to me. But be that as it may, I mean, I think it's time for us to have to consider, well, how do we leave? I mean, if it's impossible to leave, we're going to eventually have presences in countries all over the world that we can't continue to maintain. So, I mean, we're now, just in Afghanistan, Iraq, and Syria. What if we end up having to do something else? Now we're going to be in 4 countries. What
Yeah.
is the exit policy? So, I mean,
Oh,
while I understand that you don't want to leave chaos,
yeah.
uh, there also has to be a way to eventually get out. And this is, I mean, again, I'm putting that there as a kind of a libertarian pacifist.
Yeah.
Is this not just leading to more death in the long term?
It's funny. I agree with you on that, and we're you and I, in a way, we're both sort of arguing against type here, because you would normally think of I think the Republicans as being a little more hawkish and the Democrats as being a little more dovish, and we're both maybe on the opposite side of where we might be expected to be on this particular issue. But I agree completely with the goals that you just the idea that the U.S. can't have a permanent military presence all over the world and can't try to dictate to every place in the world what form of government they're going to have, which you stated. I agree completely with that. But I think on the other hand, so, the U.S. has wanted to be a world leader. We've wanted to show leadership in the world, and that does involve having to step up sometimes. And when there's very severe humanitarian crises, when there's chaos, and in this case, ISIS, it's not just the crisis that they're causing in Syria. They are a threat to the whole world, really. And so just sort of say, okay, well, we've done enough against ISIS now. Now it's time to leave. We'll let them, take over half of Syria because we're done fighting them, and then they'll have a base. I think that poses a lot of dangers that aren't. When we leave, those dangers aren't going to go away. So and I think that's why we were stuck in Afghanistan for so long. I mean, I don't want to see a U.S. military presence in Afghanistan for decades, as we actually have seen. But I also don't want to see an Afghanistan that's run by the Taliban and that's being used as a base for terrorist organizations to launch terror attacks all over the world. And so I think there's a rock and a hard place problem here.
I mean, I agree, and I understand the kind of the frustration that you both want. At the one hand, potentially want to have the United States take a world leadership role. I ironically might take a more a back seat on that front, but putting that one aside, I think the Afghanistan issue is a particularly interesting one as an analogy to Syria. I think far more so, as you've already noted, than Iraq. But one of the interesting things is about Afghanistan, so we end up kind of cleaning it up, if you will. I mean, I know that's an imperfect analogy, but in the case of the terrorist activity, a lot of that ends up just moving across the border into Pakistan, where we weren't willing to go. As a matter of fact, I mean, we even had a soldier held there. I mean, that's a whole other ball of wax. We won't get into the the details about that. But the fact that we're that border becomes porous. So in a world where that ability is easy to move from one to the other, and we're not going to suddenly start bombing Pakistan,
Right.
do these long-term stability projects, are they really stopping that, or are we just sweeping the floor to ignore what happens under the couch?
Well, certainly you're pointing out that in the nature of terrorism, you can't stop it. I mean, we can't even stop terrorism that's based in the United States, right? We have
Sure.
American terrorists committing acts of terrorism here. So you can't stop that here. You can't stop that all over the world. But I think what you can do is, there are states that Pakistan has a stable government. So the Pakistani government can play a role that we can cooperate with. We don't need to go invade Pakistan, but parts of the world that actually don't have a stable government at all, that are completely chaotic, those provide opportunities not just for lone wolf terrorists or small groups of to formulate plots, but for the sort of a version of, it's not that ISIS is actually a state, but what they're capable of is very analogous to state-sponsored terrorism, and I think that's potentially much more harmful than sort of lone wolf acts of terrorism. And even September 11th, which was 19 people, and was very, very harmful to us. It was a single day of attacks, but I think an ISIS that actually has control over the geographic territory of half of Syria, and that nobody's doing anything to rein in, could do a lot more damage to the world than that.
Well, and when we were talking about the data, we were talking about kind of the big statistical model. So let me ask a potentially difficult question on that front. So if we are analyzing kind of the costs and benefits of these long-term engagements in other countries. This is a lot of money. It's a lot of lives. What is actually this, for the country as a whole, what do you think the actual statistical gain is going to be? In other words, what's our beta change here? I mean, are we making ourselves, $100 billion safer? Have we actually gained enough for the individuals who've lost their lives over there to continue to warrant that, even if we do, contain ISIS more?
Well, I think so because I think the it's you I can't put a number on it, but I think you got to look at it not just in the context of okay, if we let ISIS have half of Syria, how much damage are they going to do? But you've also got to look at that in the context of what are we saying to our allies? Are we going to be losing U.S. credibility and U.S. leadership there? What are we saying to other terrorist organizations in other places? What are we saying to hostile countries? You could bring an analogy even back to Hitler or in World War II. We had these debates in the country about whether before Pearl Harbor was bombed, people would basically say that like U.S. shouldn't get into World War II, no matter what Hitler's doing in Europe, it's not directly going to affect the U.S. And I think if Pearl Harbor hadn't have been bombed, I still think at some point we would have got into that war because the idea is that it can't possibly be good for America or good for the world to have a Hitler regime completely ruling Europe. That's going to pose such a great threat to us in some form or another that we have to head that off early. Now that debate, I guess, got short-circuited by the bombing of Pearl Harbor, but I think sometimes what happens in the rest of the world matters to us, and I also think that what happens in the rest of the world, it matters. We should be playing a positive role in the rest of the world in the most egregious cases.
I think that's probably a point where we might have a bit of disagreement because I don't see us generally militarily. Let me be specific. Having oftentimes accomplished the goals we hoped we would have accomplished militarily, and I think in some ways we end up creating problems that we couldn't ascertain because these kinds of situations are oftentimes unpredictable. And so, on those fronts where, while I don't want to disagree with your kind of overarching point that we ought to be kind of that beacon of freedom, that long-standing military engagements do not seem to have, on the whole, netted us that, except with a few potentially notable examples, like so for World War II. But I mean, I think we could make arguments that was kind of a unique, circumstance compared to say what we're talking about in Syria or in Afghanistan. I'm again kind of putting a rock to the side for a moment.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I actually agree with you about that. I think if you count, starting from Korea in the 50s and Vietnam in the 60s and on up to these current controversies, I see the scorecard the same way you do. I think most of those, the military intervention didn't get us what our goals were. So I'm certainly not saying it's a panacea. And I would probably, on most of those interventions, Vietnam, Iraq, I was against them. I'm against them. And Syria, I even think is questionable at the moment that we went in. But I think being in there now, there would be tremendous humanitarian consequences of a immediate pullout on a 6-month timeline, and we'd really be leaving maybe even millions of people just to the wolves, and it wouldn't be it would be a victory, right? It would be a victory for outfits like ISIS that I think that would be very encouraging to them. And that could have spin-off costs. So I even recognizing the truth of what you're saying, that most of these military interventions have done nothing good for the U.S. and nothing good for the places we've intervened. I still think you have to kind of try to have that skepticism, but look at it on a case-by-case basis.
Well, I think I think we hear each other on this one, and I'll just say, because this way we'll inflame a Twitter war right off the end. We'll see how many people listen to the end. One other way to maybe that we might agree that we could help in these situations is by having more open borders
Yeah,
in the United States to kind of alleviate those kinds of sufferings. So there you
Right.
go.
Yeah, I mean, if refugees could more easily come out of Syria, we wouldn't be causing the humanitarian crisis by having our military come out of Syria. So yeah, those
Precisely.
are very related issues.
Bringing them along. But I know that now I'm going to hear a lot of things on Twitter. But anyway, but speaking of all that, Ken has been wonderful talking with us this week, and I hope you've had a good time.
Yeah, great time as always.
Good. And listeners, I hope that you've enjoyed the show as well. If you want to connect about this or any of the other bombastic things that we've been saying, to complain or ask us, you know that the Politics Guys is both on Facebook at facebook.com/politicsguys. You can also get us on Twitter at @politicsguys. We're there all the time debating things. We'd love to be interacting with you. You can, of course, also visit us on the website at www.politicsguys.com, where you can see each of our bi-weekly shows. We hope that you'll join into us next week.